Indeed, and I have to do lots of research afterwards. Okay, we will continue now with Belén Ruiz Lejarcegui. She graduated with honors and she was awarded the Extraordinary Prize 2019-2020 for her degree in English Studies here at the University of the Basque Country. She recently finished a master's degree in Comparative Literature and Literary Studies, also here, and she wrote her MA thesis on the construction and dissolution of the self and the other dichotomy in H.G. Wells's scientific romances. She's going to start a doctoral program in comparative literature where she intends to incorporate contemporary science fiction to her previous work and focus on power asymmetries and other in science fictional narrative discourse. And her presentation today is titled From Myth to Science Fiction, H.G. Wells's Human-Animal Hybrids. So the floor is yours now.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. And thank you to the rest of the speakers. I've really enjoyed the talks so far. So as Maya has said, the topic I'll discuss today is the exploration of the myth of the monster within the genre of science fiction, taking as case study H.G. Wells's reimagining of human-animal hybrids in his novel The Island of Dr. Moreau. So, representations of half-human, half-animal hybrids have proliferated in Western myths and legends since the very foundation of civilizations. Sometimes they're godlike beings, sometimes they're a result of metamorphosis. Since then, since classical antiquity, creatures such as satyrs, centaurs, and harpies have taken root in the Western cultural imaginary, and they have shaped our unidimensional and very archetypal view of the hybrid figure. So most of the times, as you can see in the picture, they are big, grotesque, and terrifying and disgusting creatures, mostly cannibalistic creatures that possess superhuman strength. Combining ghastly animalistic features and a cruelty that's characteristic of humans, these beings are usually shunned by society and they are seen as a threat to everything civilization stands for. As we will see throughout this presentation, the link between these creatures and myth is an intrinsic one, since, as Gilmore states, heroes make civilization by the example of monster taming. So, when a hero defeats the transgressive monster, the myth fulfills its moralizing function and dissuades people from ever disobeying that culture's values. However, I would argue that in the adaptation of this myth through science fiction, with its incorporation of science and contemporary anxieties, this presents a new layer of meaning to the myth by subverting the classic narrative and also developing it by adding other modern myths and reflections. Thus, what I plan to do today is to explain how Wells achieves this in The Island of Dr. Moreau and how he succeeds in offering a social commentary on humanity's inner beast. And in order to do so, first of all, let me introduce you to the novel itself. So, The Island of Dr. Moreau is a pioneering piece of science fiction written in 1896 by H.G. Wells, who's considered to be one of the founding fathers of the genre. In this novel, the protagonist and narrator called Prendick arrives in an island inhabited by these creatures. They are half-human, half-animal hybrids who have been scientifically manufactured by the antagonist of the novel, Dr. Moreau. Through a very painful process that involves cutting and manipulating bodies while they're still alive, Dr. Moreau has managed to create around 60 of these people, beast people, including an ape man, leopard man, and some creatures that resemble the Minotaur and the satyr figures. So, believing them to be animalized humans, Prendick leaves Moreau and spends some time with the beast folk, where he discovers that these creatures must abide by a set of laws, by a set of human doctrines in order to repress their animal instincts, which of course blurs the Prentice's perception of the human-animal dichotomy and changes his own views on the world. By the end of the novel, the beast folk rebel and kill Moreau, and they end up degenerating into the original animal form. And it's important to know that after Prentic is rescued and is brought home to England, it becomes evident that this experience has had a great psychological toll on him, because he doesn't see British society as civilized anymore, and instead he sees them as highly anthropomorphic beings that will at some point undergo degeneration as well. So, having contextualized the hybrids in the novel, I will now move on to explain the relation between monsters, culture, and myth. As many researchers in monster studies contend, monsters get defined according to and in response to culture-specific conditions. So they belong to a specific period of time, a specific place, and hegemonical discourses. And because of this, monsters reflect a culture's greatest fears and their desire to domesticate them. And which is why all monsters must be analyzed in the context of their creation, and which is what I will do later on with the beast folk. This domestication of cultural fears has been commonly achieved through myth. So, according to Gans, and I quote, myths codify and make manifest beliefs a culture celebrates as self-evident in order to render dichotomies such as the self and the other, man, woman, or civilized savage are only cultural categorizations that have been arbitrarily established by society in order to make sense of the world around us. And this is the case of heroes and monsters in ancient cosmologies, as they always appear as paired twins, as inseparable, where the monster always represents otherness and alterity. In fact, historically, monsters have always been metaphorically represented marginalized groups of society, embodying political, cultural, racial, sexual difference, but especially that of women and non-whites. As I mentioned briefly at the beginning, the traditional purpose of this myth, of the monster myth, is to serve as a cautionary tale and to justify humanity's superiority over the world. In what is known as a combat myth, male hero fights a male hero that represents nationhood and harmony and other cultural values, fights a monster that embodies chaos and disorder. And this conflict always leads to the monster's inevitable demise at the hand of patriarchal figures and to the development of civilizations. Therefore, by punishing the transgression implied by the very existence of the monster, as Felton states, the myth domesticates and thus disempowers the dangers and the fears the monster. However, I would argue that the figure of the hybrid is very interesting to analyze, because besides embodying alterity on its own, it's also a means of rebellion, since it's the most literal example of transgression between two opposites believed as absolutes. So, as Cohen states, the hybrid body, the body itself, explicitly threatens sociocultural categories because it resists classification through any structure. And this, the hybrid proves that otherness is in fact not naturally occurring, and it questions binary systems and social constructs as a whole. So, having explained that, I will now proceed to explain how the iteration of the hybrid, even though represented by the beast folk, even though it does adhere to some elements of the traditional myth, adds a new layer of meaning that subverts the overall function of the monster. And the first factor that contributes to this is Wells's development of the myth of creation or metamorphosis that explains the existence of the creature. So, taking for reference some human-animal hybrids that are prevalent in Western mythology and that resemble these creatures, it would seem that mostly they are brought about through divine intervention and mainly as punishment for some kind of transgression. For instance, in Apollodorus' Library of Greek Mythology, it explains how the Minotaur is conceived by Pasiphae and King Minos' white bull through divine intervention, because this is a punishment by Poseidon. And later, following the traditional combat myth, the Minotaur is killed by Theseus in the labyrinth. Similarly, while Greek mythology interprets Medusa as a fantastic creature herself, as a gorgon, the Roman take told in Ovid's Metamorphoses also explains her creation as punishment by the gods. Since Medusa is a priestess in Minerva's temple, and after she is raped by Neptune, as punishment for this violation, Minerva turns her hair into snakes. Like the Minotaur, she is also killed later on by another hero, in this case by Perseus. On the other hand, Wells shifts this principle by replacing that magical or fantastic explanation with a science fictional technique, which is to turn the monstrous other into a scientifically ratified novum. So, according to Savinian theory, a novum is an unfamiliar element that's foreign to our own reality, but that is validated within the confines of the text through the combination of otherness and reason. In other words, this means that Wells makes use of rational terms and pseudoscience in order to explain the existence of the beast folk in the novel, a pseudoscience that incorporates contemporary Victorian practices into the narrative. Many scholars agree that it's this combination of science and myth that provides such originality to Wells's novels in general. And an example of this would be Wells's hint at the myth of the island in the setting of the story. And this not only alludes to Circe's myth and anticipates the human-animal metamorphosis, but also would establish some parallels between Dr. Moreau's indoctrination of the beast folk and the colonialist endeavor of civilizing non-white communities. Secondly, regarding the power hierarchies between humans and monsters, at first glance it's true that it seems that the novel adheres to combat myths, with the exception that it's the antagonist and not the protagonist who's in a superior position. So there's many elements in the novel that point to Moreau's deification. So first of all, the incorporation of the Frankenstein myth, in which Butler defines as a ruthless mad scientist takes on the role gods have in creation myths, but unlike them, the mad scientist remains completely indifferent towards the creatures he creates. He doesn't care about their fate or their suffering at all. And because this is a post-Darwinian novel, Dr. Moreau identifies with the sublime power of evolution instead of with a legitimate deity. Additionally, in the beast folk's law I mentioned before, there are also some, the ones that repress their animal tendencies, there are also some call and response patterns that allude to some religious practices, which of course reinforce this image of Moreau as an all-powerful being. However, what's important to note is that this power hierarchy is completely altered when, as I mentioned before, the beast folk kill Moreau, and the hybrid is not defeated by the end of the story. So, not even Prendick, who's more of a spectator than a hero, really, can manage to subdue the beast folk at the end and take on Moreau's role as master. Instead, the original outcome of the hero-monster power struggle is subverted in this novel, since it's shown that humans and hybrids alike in the end undergo degeneration. And besides this subversion, I would say that there's also a development in the myth and an innovation. And I would also argue that the core difference between traditional folktale metamorphosis and Wells's reimagining is on the emphasis on pain and suffering through vivisection. That's the method Moreau uses to make the beast folk. In order to understand this, we must first look at the context in which the novel was written. So, during the last decades of the 19th century, there was a stark disagreement among scientists regarding the ethics of conducting vivisection. On the one hand, the human-animal evolutionary lineage proved by Darwin seemingly justifies the experimentation because they have there's a big physiological resemblance between both. But on the other hand, that very same link ethically condemns the practice because many people thought it was immoral to exert so much pain on humanity's ancestors. So, in this context, and unlike the Greco-Roman examples I mentioned before, Wells heavily emphasizes the beast folk's life as an ending agony and Moreau's ruthlessness as a vivisector. I think, in the novel there are many passages in which Prendick emphasizes how the beast folk's life resembles basically an uninterrupted struggle for existence. Since there's pain at the very beginning of their creation through that painful metamorphosis, but also at throughout the rest of the life because they must live by a set of tenets. If we compare this with the original myth, Medusa and the Minotaur's cases, this is not what happens. The myth only explains how they were created and establishes their function as a monster of prohibition. In the end, we can see in this quote, we could contend that the outline of Dr. Moreau shows monstrous creatures that are recognized not as symbolic objects with a set function to fulfill, but as sentient beings with feelings and pain, the capacity to feel pain and aspirations of their own. Since Prendick concludes the following: save from the grossness of the line, the grotesqueness of the forms, I had here before me the whole balance of human life in miniature, the whole interplay of instinct, reason, and fate in its simplest form. And last but not least, I would just like to add that besides this generating empathetic responses, this human-animal lineage also poses a more imminent threat than in previous mythical renditions. And this happens because literal anthropomorphism raises the question of monstrous anthropomorphism, which basically means that because the beast folk were created in the laboratory through science, real-life science, this raises the question of what would happen if humanity one day also degenerated into a hybrid state. And as a result, this would establish a direct connection between humans and beast folks when since the beast folk represent humanity's beast within that everyone must suppress in order to live in society, and also a future evolutionary state for humankind. To conclude, I have attempted to show how the iteration of the hybrid in this novel offers more nuanced personifications of monstrous identity than traditional combat myths through several reasons. First of all, Wells's subversion of the original function, his combination of myth and science, and the use of vivisection to endorse empathy and introspection. And I would contend that this analysis overall allows us to reflect on the use and repurposing of myths alongside contemporary matters in order to talk about many types of issues of society or human condition in general. And finally, I would just like to say that this representation of the hybrid poses, in the end, poses more philosophical ramifications, because the monster is no longer an external threat. And instead, Wells suggests that it could potentially be, or maybe already is, lying dormant within each and every one of us. So this is the bibliography I've used, and that has been all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, for this excellent presentation. you look as if you had been doing this for a really long time. So congratulations. And now I just open the floor for the Q&A. And those at home, also feel free to raise your hand or to type your questions. Okay, Raul again.
Hi, again, this is me again. Okay, so first of all, I was thinking one thing, and it's very close to your last comment. I was listening to the three speakers, and I can't see you as our students, but almost as unequals. I mean, you are like nowadays proper academics, so very well done, very well constructed the presentations, and we are very proud again. And yes, I'm going to let time for the rest of the audience for your questions. But one question just is food for thought for David mainly, right? Because you have started speaking about metaphysical poetry and so on, and maybe, I don't know if you agree or not, I miss a reference to probably metaphysical poetry or John Donne, because, okay, romanticism was there, but there was something before. And moreover, when you have presented a comment about Barfield and Tolkien, about inspiration, it is just a way of replicating what epic poetry presented, about how inspiration was created, or moreover, Milton's Paradise Lost, when he asks for inspiration to God, for that muse who is going to drive, his hands. So there was something before. And maybe, yes, to keep it in mind can be handy for the future. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah, Martina?
I have it's rather a comment, but also a question to Anna. H.G. Wells, which is the end of the 19th century, and then the interwar period, but in between the 19th century and the interwar period, you have the Great War. And I was wondering whether you were looking at the impact of the Great War upon monstrosity. I was thinking about the question of monstrosity in terms of physicality, that is the men or soldiers with the broken faces who were seen as monsters and were hidden from the society and were called gargoyles. And also the theme of monstrosity as the return to the beast theme in war fiction and film, like Liam O'Flaherty wrote the novel Return to the Beast. You have Eric Remarque, who also writes about soldiers and beasts. Have you been doing also this kind of study as a monstrosity, not in myth, not as a fiction, but in real life?
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. It's very interesting because I haven't, so far, my research on Wells has been limited to his early fiction, because apparently he has two different phases on his production. Those are the scientific romances of the late 19th century, and I think they end by 1901. And the rest of the fiction he wrote is more political, and maybe there are some of those topics you've talked about on those novels that they are. I know I haven't read them yet, but I know they are very didactic and very moralizing. So I wouldn't put it past him to tackle those topics. But I think it's a very interesting theme to explore. Because we've been talking about this sometimes before, about how this novel is also related to disability studies in some ways, because there's a lot of emphasis on how the beast folk aren't fully humans because they lack something, or because they don't exactly resemble the rest of society or the human model. So I assume that during those periods, people who came back from the war as cripples or with some kind of impediments were also must have felt that kind of marginalization. So it's a very interesting connection, but so far I haven't researched on that. But thank you for the idea.
Always pushing everybody into the Great War.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, Martin wants to ask something.
Yes, thank you very much to all of you who have been presenting this morning. Not only this panel, but the previous one as well. Endorsing the words that Raúl has just addressed us with. I'm really proud of you all, and it's just great to listen to such good academic performers here today. Now, I think that it's a good opportunity perhaps to expand now, just very briefly, but still to let us know a little bit more about your current research. And this is more or less, to some extent at least, the basis for other types of research into other areas of knowledge within the same field, but still, I mean, could you all perhaps tell us very shortly where this original research will be taking you, will be leading you in the future? I'm sure the audience would appreciate that as well. Thank you.
So briefly, to explain our work, so I'm researching Tolkien and Tolkien's Middle-earth, and particularly looking at the natural parts of that Middle-earth is made of. And I'm using the Silmarillion as the background to understand not just what's the meaning of those places as the company or the fellowship goes through all the Middle-earth, right, from the Shire to Mount Doom, but to understand what's the metaphysical, what other layers of meaning we find in Middle-earth. And my argument is that Middle-earth is a character in itself, and very much has an important role to play. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So for me, this was a bit of a guinea pig, I guess. It is a bit of what I'm doing in my thesis, but on a smaller scale. What I want to do, as Amaya has already told you, is analyze how a British archetype is brought to Japan and how this changes the archetype. And I do it through the lens of post-colonialism. So for me, this is like the entry point to a very big mess I'm getting myself into, of demonstrating that we need to stop thinking about nationalities and cultures as close things only. Like, we need to understand that culture will always be a continuum, and that yes, for instance, the Shinigami is Japanese, but it's something we wouldn't have if, I don't know, if people in Japan hadn't read the Bible and had read the Apocalypse and thought of the pale horse, I think it's called, death. So yeah, for me this is the entry point to propose that we need to abolish all these barriers that in a moment that everyone is very much focused on their own nationalism and what makes a culture, like for instance, what makes Spanish culture Spanish. We need to start seeing that every culture is hybrid. We live in a hybrid world, and we are not doing us any favor in pretending that it is a different way. That's it.
Well, mine is also deals about the hybrid, but in a different way. I do plan on expanding the topic I've talked about today in my PhD thesis, but I want to incorporate more contemporary works of science fiction, and that's the reason why I want to include all different kinds of hybrids. So, as we were mentioning before, I wanted to incorporate some posthumanism to my thesis, and talk also about the human/machine hybrid or AIs and those kinds of non-hegemonical identities and how they are basically the overall topic would be to focus on how power asymmetries are or how power structures are disturbed through these creatures and how most of the times that is related through language and how they are addressed, how they address themselves and the power of naming things or calling something a thing itself. So, but I still haven't decided yet. I haven't even done I haven't done the paperwork to start the PhD itself. So, I'm still thinking about it. Thank you.
Well, I think many of us can relate to or resonate with Natalia's words of like entering this big mess. While doing the PhD, I'm still trying to find my way out, but here there's plenty of proof that there is a way out. So, yeah. Any final questions or thoughts? Okay.
Thank you. So I have just a quick question for Natalia. Is the archetype of the Shinigami, has it been manipulated in any way, in any political way? Has it been used by younger generations in any subversive way to make a political statement, or is it more like a popular icon? I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Oh, yeah. You spoke perfectly. I would say, well, first, for context, after World War II, the country has went downhill from the spiritual point of view. They had a very blocked vision of religion. So what happened afterwards is that there has been a very big proliferation of new views on spirituality. Personally, I think that the Shinigami is so popular because many times it mocks the idea of death. Many times they are like just comic characters. And they are comedic characters, but they are also inherently serious because they deal with a tough topic. So I haven't found any particular trend, but I don't think individual authors try to make points through these figures. For instance, if you are familiar with an anime that is called Death Note, like it's super famous right now, like the philosophical baggage that the Shinigami have in that worldview is incredible. It is used to think about the ways the legal system treats people, for instance, in prison. Because I don't know if you know that in Japan there's still the death penalty, and there are very interesting studies about how Death Note is related to death penalty. If you're interested, I can share them.
Sure.
So, yeah, I do think individual authors do choose to use those characters with subversive intentions, but I haven't found out any particular trend. Then again, I haven't looked at every single one for that, so I don't know, maybe there is. And that's it. Thank you.